दिल्ली के शायरों की बात हो और मिर्जा गालिब का जिक्र ना आए लेकिन नामुमकिन है। और आप सबके चेहरों से ऐसा लग रहा है कि आप मुंतज़िर हैं कि मैं आपको गालिब के बहुत सारे अशआर सुनाऊंगा। मैं आपकी इन उम्मीदों पे पानी फेरना नहीं चाहता, लेकिन अगर गालिब का कलाम सुनना ही है तो आप यूट्यूब पर जा सकते हैं बड़ी आसानी से। मुझसे कहीं बेहतर कहने वाले नवाजुद्दीन साहब की आवाज में, फरीदा खानम साहिबा की आवाज में, बहुत सारे लोगों की आवाज में आप सुन सकते हैं। मैं कुछ इस बेहतरीन किताब के कुछ हिस्से पढ़ के सुनाना चाहता हूँ, क्योंकि कुछ ऐसी बहुत सारी बातें हैं। एक तो मैं ये सबसे पहले बता दूं कि मैं उर्दू का आलिम बिल्कुल नहीं हूँ और उर्दू शायरी का भी नहीं। मुझे मिर्जा गालिब समझा जाता है, इसमें मेरा कोई कसूर नहीं। और गालिब का कलाम वैसे ही हर एक जानता है। उनके मशहूर नज़्मों या गज़लों को पढ़ने का मेरे ख्याल से कोई फायदा नहीं है। मैंने सोचा कि मैं आपको इस किताब के कुछ ऐसे हिस्से पढ़ के सुनाऊं जो ऐसे शोरा के बारे में जिनका मैंने नाम भी नहीं सुना, और उनके बारे में जो कुछ बातें हैं, तो मैं सिर्फ मिर्जा मोहम्मद रफी सौदा के मजमून से और बहादुर शाह जफर के मजमून से कुछ आप लोगों को बातें सुनाना चाहता हूँ। गालिब साहब की एक नज़्म जरूर सुनाऊंगा जो यकीनन आपने कभी नहीं सुनी, लेकिन उससे पहले सैफ साहब के इस बेहतरीन इंट्रोडक्शन पेश लफ्ज से मैं कुछ हिस्से पढ़ना चाहता हूँ, क्योंकि दिल्ली की तवारीख और 19वीं सदी में जो अदबी हालात थे वो क्या थे उनके बारे में। तो ये इंट्रोडक्शन है इसके बाद का, जिसके कुछ हिस्से में आपको बता सुनाऊंगा। Delhi's charms are unpredictable. The chaotic streets, the unruly traffic and polluted air, the aggressive inhabitants and their hurried life, the tolerance or the obnoxious. All these constitute an integral part of this phenomenal city. In beauty resides horror and vice versa. Inextricably intertwined with Delhi's complicated present is her violent history. A history of invasions and assaults, even massacres. It has been lamented many times through the centuries, yet it lives. Each time it was razed to the ground, it came back to life with startling vivacity. Nothing dies in Delhi. The ghosts of its past lives roam the streets or bide their time in half-ruined buildings, and they rise up to speak in 1,000 voices that are still told about the city. Struggling to breathe under the angry modern facade of the megalopolis is another one, time-worn and easily missed, that teems with art, heritage and poetry. It is the Delhi of Mir and Ghalib, the Delhi of the fabled 7 cities, all of which have risen and fallen and risen again, or been changed beyond recognition over time. Delhi's indestructible spirit has haunted writers and poets for generations. Some of them have written out of love, others in awe, and yet others out of bewilderment. In the 18th century, Mir said, "Dilo dilli dono agar hain kharab, par kuch lutf is ujle ghar mein bhi." In the middle of the 20th century, Percival Spear compared Delhi with Rome. There are many etymologies that have been offered for the name Delhi, but perhaps one of the most appealing is the philosopher Ramchandra Gandhi's suggestion that its name could derive from the words Delhi or Delhi, both meaning threshold. a permanent point of entry and departure, but forever resistant to any stamp of permanence. The city Delhi most resembles is Athens, with its monumental crumbling history strewn all around, its ramshackle, seething present. In this seething present, Delhi is bigger, more sprawling than it has ever been. Officially called the National Capital Territory of Delhi, it is the third largest city of India in terms of size, covering an area of approximately 1,500 square kilometers and the second largest in terms of population, home to more than 25 million people. And in the heart of this megacity, in the northeast of its central district, lies Purani Delhi, Old Delhi, where the tale of its glory and ruin and haphazard regeneration is best perceived. It is this walled city of narrow, crowded and cacophonous alleys where it is impossible to walk a few paces or even stand still without touching literally at least 10 other people that this book is about. Or rather about a few great men of verse who internalized the spirit of this remarkable patch of earth so deeply that they were Delhi and Delhi was them. And together, Purani Delhi and its iconic poets tell a 300-year-old story. The story of one of the most evocative languages ever known to humankind, Urdu. It is generally believed that Urdu was born in the army camps of Delhi as a language that borrowed words from different languages so that soldiers from different parts could easily communicate with each other. Those who subscribe to this belief think that since in Turkish the word Urdu refers to an army camp and the language was a product of interaction between soldiers in army camps, it was called Urdu. Noted author and critic Shamsur Rahman Farooqi, however, dismisses this claim. What he writes is, Farooqi Sahab writes, the belief that Urdu originated in Muslim army camps and cantonment bazaars helped generate and sustain two myths. Urdu was the language of the Muslims, and being originally the language of camp and cantonment, it stood in natural need of being refined and gentrified. And the process was initiated by the master poets of Delhi in the second half of the 18th century. Small wonder then that the name Urdu, which didn't come into use for the language before the 1780s, is invariably invoked by our historians to prove that since Urdu means army camp, or the market of a camp, the Urdu language was born as a result of foreign Muslims and local Hindus interacting with each other for petty trade and commerce. None struggled to consider that the only foreign armies in India during and from the 1780s were British and some French. There were no Arabic or Persian or Turkish-speaking armies in India from the 1780s. And the language of Urdu had by then been in existence for several centuries. Thus, the name Urdu, which first came into use apparently in the 1780s, could not have been given to the language because of the putative army connection. A ghazal is a collection of many couplets, sher, of the same length and following the same meter. These couplets are thematically autonomous of each other. Sometimes, though, a few of them can be read together, indicating a single theme, and when this is done, the cluster of couplets is called qita or qata. Each line of a sher is called a misra, and the first sher of a ghazal is called the matla. In the matla, the two lines rhyme with each other, whereas throughout the rest of the ghazal, only the second lines of the sher rhyme with each other. The last couplet of the ghazal, in which the poet's takhallus pseudonym appears as a signature, is called the maqta. Now I'd like to read to you about Mirza Muhammad Rafi's Sauda. In my ignorance of Urdu literature or Urdu poetry, I always assumed that Urdu poets have no sense of humor. Ghalib, of course, is an honorable exception. So to discover what the existence of Mirza Muhammad Rafi Sauda, whom Saif Saab refers to as the great satirist, was a perfect, absolute delight. Sauda was born as Mirza Muhammad Rafi in Delhi in 1713 to Mirza Muhammad Shafi, an Afghan aristocrat who had migrated to India for trade. Sauda lived in Delhi's Kabuli Darwaza area, close to what is today known as Naya Bazar near Khadi Baoli, which was an upmarket neighborhood back then, inhabited by the city's elite and connoisseurs of art and culture. Those were the times when the domni or courtesan had a distinct place in society. Courtesans were not only trained in music and dance, but also well versed in poetry and would often receive influential guests for exclusive evening performances. The easiest route to reach the Qila-e-Mualla, the Red Fort, the seat of the Mughal Empire from Kabuli Darwaza, was through Chawli Bazaar, then an avenue on which stood the elegant mansions of some of Delhi's best-known courtesans. Such was the splendor of this avenue that it inspired the poet Rasif Azimabadi to compare it to the famed Mount Caucasus of West Asia. Chawli qaaf hai ya khulde bani hai Rasif, jamgate hooron ki pariyon ke phire rehte hain. Sauda originally wrote in Persian for many years. It was at the insistence of a great Persian poet and Urdu scholar of the time, Sirajuddin Ali Khan Arzu, known to history as Khan-e-Arzu, that he started writing in Urdu. Arzu was the author of two highly regarded Urdu dictionaries and ustad or teacher to many an aspiring poet, including Mirza Masar Jane-Jana and the young Mir Qadimi. Of Khan-e-Arzu, it has been said that his relationship with Urdu literature is equivalent to Aristotle's place in the tradition of philosophy. Unfortunately, none of his verses has been preserved. While Sauda's poetry started becoming popular around 1745, when he was in his early 30s, his fame seems to have reached the Mughal court only after 2 decades or so. In these 2 decades, much had changed in Mughal Delhi. Rangila, the great patron of the arts, had died after ruling for 28 years, and after 3 of his successors came and went in quick succession, within 11 years, Shah Alam II ascended to the Mughal throne. In those days, rulers and aristocrats who were fond of poetry and wanted to improve their poetic skills would request established poets or scholars to mend their poems. Ghazal Banana. Though this meant changing an occasional word to either enhance the musicality or quality of a verse or to correct its meter, it is widely believed that under the cloak of mending, many rich young princes and nobles could actually get their poetry ghost-written for a fee. It was a fantastic arrangement. While the broke poet, who could or would do nothing other than composing verse, would not mind infusion of additional income, his rich benefactor would earn poetry. Something like our screenplay writers of film industry. In or around 1765, impressed by Sauda's literary prowess, Shah Alam II invited him to the Qila-e-Mualla and sought his help with his poetic skills. Sauda was a no-nonsense man. Soon the emperor's royal demands began to irritate him. It is believed that one morning the emperor was insisting that Sauda write a particular ghazal for him, and Sauda was avoiding the recitation. The emperor finally asked him, "Mirza, how many ghazals do you manage to compose every day?" Sauda replied, "My lord, I manage to compose only 3 or 4 verses." To this the emperor condescendingly said, "My friend, I compose 3 or 4 whole ghazals while I'm in my bathroom every morning." "No wonder they smell so bad," said Sauda, and came away. There is a little bit a selection of... Sauda was also a philosopher of sorts. With her unmatched grace and elegance, Zahra Nigah, the celebrated Urdu poet, and one of the greatest connoisseurs of the works of Sauda and Mir, recited a poem to me, in which Sauda beautifully explains how a youngster anxious to gain quick success, visited a wise man and asked him for Nuskha-e-Kimia, the fabled formula for the elixir which infuses eternal life in humans and makes them conquer death. The wise man told the youngster that he would give him the formula, but the elixir would work only on one condition. When asked what that condition was, the wise man replied that the elixir maker should never let the danger of a monkey, bandar ka khatra, cross his mind. This condition, of course, can never be fulfilled. The moment the elixir maker is done with preparing the magical potion and is gleeful and relieved that he did not let the danger or fear of a monkey cross his mind all the while, the thought of that very danger actually enters his mind. And thus, the elixir is rendered ineffective. The point of this story is that if you cannot conquer your fear, no magic formula will work. I took it off by mistake. Okay, sorry about that. So I'll read you the poem, which is quite delightful. कहा जाए है एक मोहब्बस का हाल कि रखता था नित कीमिया का ख्याल, ये सब करके दिल के बीच अपने कयास गया वो एक मर्द कामिल के पास, रहा उसकी खिदमत में वो चंद साल, किया मौका पा के आखिर सवाल कि अगर नुस्खे कीमिया याद हो तो बंदे को भी अपने इरशाद हो। कहा अगर यही था तेरा मुद्दा तो देता हूं तुझको, तू जा और ला, ये अज्जा है इसके, ये लेकर बना मगर इसमें एक शर्त है दरमियान, ये नुस्खा तू जिस वक्त लेकर बनाए कभू दिल में बंदर का खतरा न लाए। कहा अब तो ये बात मुमकिन नहीं जो खतरा हो दिल में वो जाए नहीं, न समझा गरज उसके रंज व नुकात के पर्दे में थी मर्द आरिफ की बात कि अगर दिल को खतरे के काबू किया यो फिर है नुस्खे कीमिया। And now I'd like to read to you a selection from the chapter on Bahadur Shah Zafar. It begins with this extremely moving description by William Dalrymple from his book The Last Novel. At 4 p.m. on a hazy, humid winter's afternoon in Rangoon in November 1862, soon after the end of the monsoon, a shrouded corpse was escorted by a small group of British soldiers to an anonymous grave at the back of a walled prison enclosure. The bier of the state prisoner, as the deceased was referred to, was accompanied by 2 of his sons and an elderly bearded mullah. The ceremony was brief. The British authorities had made sure not only that the grave was already dug, but that quantities of lime were on hand to guarantee the rapid decay of both bier and body. When the shortened funeral prayers had been recited, no lamentations or panegyrics were allowed. The earth was thrown in over the lime and the turf carefully replaced, so that within a month or so, no mark would remain to indicate the place of burial. This funeral, described so memorably by Dalrymple, is not of a notorious criminal or common prisoner, but that of the last Mughal emperor of India, Mirza Abu Zafar Sirajuddin Muhammad Bahadur Shah, an accomplished music composer, a revered Sufi, a distinguished theologian, a great connoisseur of art and poetry, and a poet himself known to the world as Bahadur Shah Zafar. For more than 200 years, Zafar's Timurid ancestors had ruled the larger chunk of South Asia with a splendid and ostentatious display of wealth and authority, frequently translated into matchless architectural wonders and peerless artistic marvels. However, after the death of Aurangzeb in 1707, the empire had started fragmenting. By the time Zafar inherited the throne in 1837, he was already 62 and frail. Delhi had changed. The territorial limits of the empire barely extended beyond the walls of the Qila Mohalla, the Red Fort, and the grandeur of the Mughal crown had almost faded away, forcing Zafar to compare it with a beggar's bowl. Ya mujhe afsar-e Shabana banaya hota, ya mera taj gadayana banaya hota. Roz mamur-e dunya mein kharabi hai Zafar, aisi basti se to veerana banaya hota. Zafar's idea of piety and his attitude to religion were closer to those of the ordinary people of his land than of austere theologians and clergy. According to some of his biographers, he was predisposed to common earthly beliefs. For instance, that thieves and saints possess supernatural powers. He had his own inner circle of astrologers, soothsayers, and clairvoyants. As protection against the evil eye, he would himself use and also distribute to his disciples all kinds of charms and would regularly sacrifice animals, donate cows to the poor, bury eggs, and order arrests of black magicians. Read urban Naxals. He was not only convinced of the existence of jinns, but also believed that they were amongst his loyal subjects. When the British began the massacre of Delhi to crush the 1857 mutiny, Zafar was initially unperturbed because his spiritual advisors had persuaded him to believe that no harm could come to an emperor who was protected by jinns. Zafar was well aware that the Mughal throne he had inherited was a sham and the empire mere fiction. Even to travel up to the dargahs at Nizamuddin or Mehroni from his qila, he had to seek permission of the British resident. As his 2-decade-long symbolic rule progressed and years passed by, he became more and more distraught by a situation that he could do nothing about. Even age was not on his side. He felt worthless and helpless. The Qila-e-Mualla, despite the collapse of the Mughal Empire and the strange circumstances of the emperor, frequently played host to a large number of poets, writers, and artists. These included Hakim Sanaullah Khan Firaq, not to be confused with the famous Firaq Gorakhpuri, who was born decades later, Mir Ghalib Ali Sayyid, not to be confused with Mirza Ghalib, Hafiz Abdul Rahman Khan Ehsan, Burhanuddin Khan Zat, Hakim Qudratullah Qasim, his son Mir Izzatullah Ishq, Mia Shakeva, a disciple of Mir Fatih Mir, Mirza Azim Beg, and Mir Qamaruddin Minnat, and his son Mir Nizamuddin Mamnoon. For an Urdu poet, the greatest honor would be an invitation to recite at the royal mushaira in the Qila. Like most poets, Zauq too, that was the poet laureate, Mirza Ibrahim Zauq, Hazrat Ibrahim Zauq, too had an ardent desire to be associated with the Qila. His friend Beqarar worked for the royal family and was engaged in the personal staff of Bahadur Shah Zafar, who the then heir apparent or crown prince. On the advice of a few well-wishers, Zauq persuaded Beqarar to introduce him to the Wali-e-Ahad, then 22 years old. Zauq became a regular visitor in the Qila, and the Wali-e-Ahad soon became extremely fond of his poetry. Zafar, however, no, that's a little later.
Thanks for the book, some beautiful photographs. We'll join in the discussion. So let's start with the conversation.
I was born in Bombay and I found that many of the Marathi words, Hindi words, etc. With me, it was just the other way around. I was born and brought up literally in the lab of Urdu. In my family, we used to have different divane ghalib in every room, and divane in every room, and the conversations were not only about poetry, but also in poetry. I'll give you an example. हमारे पास एक खरगोश था, अपने घर में पाला हुआ था. तो हम लोग रात को जो है डाइनिंग टेबल पर बैठे खाना खा रहे थे, स्कूल. एंड वो खरगोश साथ में वो किचन के दरवाजे से झांक के देखते थे. उनको बुलाई तो अंदर वापस चले जाते हैं। तो हमारी अम्मा ने दाग का बहुत मशहूर शेर पढ़ा कि खूब पड़ता है कि चिलमन से लगे बैठे हैं, साफ छुपते भी नहीं, सामने आते भी नहीं। इसी तरह ही वो हमेशा से। And Delhi is what was Delhi has always enchanted me. It didn't when I was growing up in Delhi. Even though the Delhi of my school days and college days was a far more, it was a more beautiful place and calmer and more peaceful, etc. तो मैं एक ब्लॉग लिखा करता था और उसका टाइटल था दिल्ली जो एक शहर है, मीर के पास में क्या गया। And from that blog, extractions used to be published in first city. उर्दू के शोरा में 3-4 जैसे गालिब को आपने भी फरमाया कि नजमुद्दौला और खिताब सब दिए गए और उनसे कहा गया कि भाई आप ये लिखिए हिस्ट्री ऑफ द मुगल एम्पायर इन पर्शियन। ऐसे कुछ मेरे साथ भी हुआ था। लाइक गालिब है टोटली हुमायूं देन स्टॉप विद द वे टेक बैक स्टाइल। सो वाज आई आल्सो स्टॉप आफ्टर 3। लेकिन फिर मुझे ये सोचा कि साहब ये काम जो है इसको करना चाहिए। तो दिल्ली जो है वो वैसे तो ट्रेडिशनली आप देखिए एक जुबानों में cities have been referred to in the feminine gender, but more so for Delhi because Delhi was the female beloved of her poets. So in the title, I have bowed down to this archaic traditional use, romantic use, but in the entire book, I have used the safer it. Beloved Delhi and it.
You're reaching it out.
पहुंचे वो लोग रुतबे को कि मुझे शिकवे वक्ते नारसा न रहा। Those people have occupied lofty positions that I no longer regret having reached those heights. ये सौदा है। और दूसरी बात, एक शेर और, and this शेर I'm going to recite now is actually very apt for the current days. Because we have these Twitter and Facebook professors and all of these. उनके लिए बहुत ही उम्दा शेर ये है कि जौहर न होवे जिसमें जौहर शहनाज क्यों, but a man without the ornament of knowledge should not be able to judge or evaluate jewels. जौहर न होवे जिसमें जौहर शहनाज क्यों हो, जो साहिबे हुनर हो वो ही हुनर को करे। एक आपकी बात सौदा के बारे में बहुत बड़ी बात। आज लोगों के रिलीजियस सेंटिमेंट्स बड़े जल्दी बढ़ जाते हैं, चाहे वो मुसलमान हो या हिंदू हो या कोई भी। सौदा का बात पर एक शेर सुना। There has been a tradition in Urdu poetry of being very liberal with God. आप अल्लाह के बारे में जो चाहे कह सकते हैं Urdu poetry में, but when you talk of the Prophet, you must be very cautious. एक फारसी की नस्ल भी है इसमें कि बा खुदा दीवाना बाश और बा मोहम्मद होशियार। अब आप जरा सौदा का शेर सुनिए, he defines this. The Prophet's first wife, Prophet Muhammad's first wife, Khadija, was also his employer. अब आप जरा शेर सुनिए सौदा का कि बाजारे मोहब्बत में नबूवत का बहा क्या? What value does Prophet would hold in the bazaar of love? अब होंगे Prophet अपने घर में हो, बाजारे मोहब्बत में नबूवत का बहा क्या? एक जन के लिया मोल तभी चंद दिरहम से। अब woman got the Prophet for a couple of dirhams. आज की तारीख में कोई कह नहीं सकता था। पाकिस्तान में कहे तो उसको मार दिया जाएगा 10 की न्यूज़ के अंदर, यहाँ पे 5-6 सत्रह को आएंगे। अब ऐसे ही है, आपको बाकी तो उसके बारे में कुछ नहीं है। ख्वाजा मीर का So when Nadir Shah was leading Delhi and Ahmad Shah Abdali came after him, there was blood flowing in the streets of Delhi. In a quiet corner in a hermitage in Delhi was sitting this Sufi saint called Khwaja Mir Gam. अब हालांकि वो एक दरगाह से ज्यादा नशीन थे और he belonged to an illustrious family of Sufi saints etc. लेकिन शेर आप देखिए साहब, तर दामनी पे शेर हमारी न जाएगी, दामन निचोड़ दे तो फरिश्ते हुजूर हैं। मैं मेरे लिए गीला दामन है because of wine, if I it's soaked in wine, which is why it is wet. उसको मैं अगर निचोड़ दूँ तो इतना प्योर है वो कि फरिश्ते भी आके वुज़ू करेंगे उससे, clean themselves up. ये ख्वाजा मीर है, ख्वाजा मीर हेलो just like
सर इधर
सर यहाँ सर
सर इधर
नासिर सर,
नजीर सर इधर
all of you are straight.
सर स्टेट
Mixed. Yes, I will. देखिए, दिल्ली का ये है कि 18वीं और 19वीं सदी में जब मुग़ल एम्पायर बिल्कुल ख़त्म हो रहा था, इट वॉज इन अ स्पेक्टेकुलर डिक्लाइन, तो दिल्ली में एक नया किंगडम जो है वो उभर के आ रहा था एंड दिल्ली प्लेड होस्ट टू द किंगडम ऑफ उर्दू पोइट्री। उर्दू शायरी लखनऊ, हैदराबाद और दिल्ली 3 जगह जो है वो पनप रही थी, लेकिन दिल्ली की जो उर्दू शायरी, जो जामे मस्जिद की जो उर्दू शायरी है, वो पूरी एक मुकम्मल तहजीब है। इट्स अ कंप्लीट एग्जॉस्टिव कल्चर इन इटसेल्फ, और वो सिर्फ दिल्ली की जामा मस्जिद की सीढ़ियों का ही हिस्सा है। वो शायरी आपको ना लखनऊ में मिलेगी, ना आपको हैदराबाद में या दक्कन में मिलेगी। तो मैंने ये सोचा कि जब 200 साल दिल्ली में सिर्फ और सिर्फ जो है तबाही मच रही है, नादिर शाह आ रहा है, उसके बाद अहमद शाह अब्दाली आ रहा है, सड़कों पे खून की नदियाँ बह रही हैं, उस वक्त बहुत ज़रूरी है ये जानना कि उस वक्त दिल्ली में और क्या चल रहा था। और मेरा ये ख़्याल है कि जब हिस्टोरियन या राइटर या मुअर्रिख़ हिंदुस्तान की तारीख़ के लिए कलम उठाएगा, ख़ास तौर पे दिल्ली की तारीख़ के लिए, तो उसको हमारे क्लासिकी उर्दू लिटरेचर का सहारा ज़रूर लेना पड़ेगा, क्योंकि उससे बेहतर सहारा तारीख़ को लिखने के लिए नहीं है। मीर का शेर है जो मैंने इस किताब पे लिखा भी हुआ है कि दिल और दिल्ली दोनों अगर हैं ख़राब, पर कुछ लुत्फ़ उस उजड़े घर में भी है। तो वो जो लुत्फ़ उस उजड़े घर में है वो आपको और कहीं नहीं मिलेगा। बकौल इकबाल की जो मज़ा कबूतर के लहू में है वो कबूतर में भी नहीं। तो सिर्फ उस लुत्फ़ के लिए मैंने ये किताब लिखी है।
सर, इसके अलावा बहुत अच्छी अच्छी जगहों को भी आपने एक्सप्लोर किया है, लेकिन तो उसके बारे में बताइए सर। फोटोग्राफ्स हमने देखे कुछ,
उस फोटोग्राफ्स जो हैं किताब में, उनका मकसद ये है बताने के लिए कि ये जो जगहें हैं जहाँ ये शायर पैदा हुए या रहे, जहाँ उन्होंने अपने मुशायरे पढ़े, जहाँ वो लोग मरे, जहाँ वो दफन हैं, उनके ढाबे, उनके चाय खाने, उन सब का हमने आज क्या किया। डू वी हैव इवन अ वेस्टिज ऑफ प्राइड इन आवर सेल्फ टू सेलिब्रेट दोज प्लेसेस और इवन प्रिजर्व दोज प्लेसेस। आप लोगों ने तस्वीरें देखी, आप देखिए क्या बुरा हाल है। किसी की कब्र पे जो है वो पाखाने बने हैं, किसी की कब्र पे जो है वो ताले लगे हुए हैं, कुछ पता ही नहीं है। किसी मीर की कब्र का तो पता ही नहीं है कि कहाँ है। तो वो कह गए थे ना साहिब लुधियानवी साहब की, कल और आएंगे कलियों की फूलों की गिनती कलियाँ चुनने वाले, मुझसे बेहतर कहने वाले, तुमसे बेहतर सुनने वाले। मुझे लगता है हम लोगों ने ये बात बड़ी सीरियसली ले ली है कि साहब और आएंगे, हमें क्यों पूछा जाए। तो अगर ये सब कुछ, मैं यकीन के साथ कह सकता हूँ कि दिल्ली में, आप पुरानी दिल्ली में चले जाइए, गली कासिम जान में हर एक मोड़ पे आपको एक ऐसा मॉन्यूमेंट मिल जाएगा जो दिल्ली को की अजमत जो है वो रोम से भी ज़्यादा बढ़ा सकता है। लेकिन हम लोगों ने उसका जो है, बहुत बदकिस्मती है हमारी कि हम लोगों ने उसका कोई ख्याल नहीं किया।
सर उसके लिए कितनी रिसर्च करनी पड़ी आपको?
किताब लिखने में मुझे 3.5 साल के करीब लगे हैं, और आप किताब में देखेंगे तो एक बड़ी एक्सटेंसिव सी बिब्लियोग्राफी है उन सब किताबों की, उन सब आर्टिकल्स की जो मैंने साइट किए हैं अपनी किताब में, और 152 तो नोट्स हैं सिर्फ किताब में, फुट नोट्स। तो मैंने बहुत ज़रूरी बात बताने वाली ये है कि मैं हिस्टोरियन नहीं हूँ साहब, मैं उर्दू का शायर भी नहीं हूँ। मैंने सिर्फ दिल्ली और उर्दू की मोहब्बत में ये किताब लिखी है। तो इस किताब को आप सिर्फ वैसे पढ़ें जैसे आप किसी द वे यू विल रीड अ लवर्स लेटर्स ऑन लव, नॉट एज अ फिलोसफिकल बुक ऑन मेटाफिजिकल एस्पेक्ट्स ऑफ लव। तो ज़्यादा वक्त इस बात में लगा कि जो बात मैं कह रहा हूँ, क्योंकि मैं खुद हिस्टोरियन नहीं हूँ, उसको 2 जगह से 4 जगह से डबल चेक कर लिया जाए, कोई गलती ना हो हिस्ट्री की उसमें। तो इसमें बहुत वक्त लगा, करीब 3.5 साल में मैंने किताब पूरी।
सर इसके अलावा जो लफ्ज़ थे वो बहुत ही अच्छे थे, लेकिन नसीर साहब ने जब वो लफ्ज़ को पढ़े तो उस पर 4 चांद लग गए। उसके लिए क्या कहेंगे आप?
नसीर साहब का तो साहब ये है कि जब हम स्कूल या कॉलेज में पढ़ते हैं तो वो मिर्ज़ा गालिब की शक्ल में हमारे सामने आए, और इवन समबडी लाइक मी जो बचपन से जो है हर घर में हर कमरे में जो है दीवाने गालिब पढ़ रहा है बैठ के, उसके लिए भी गालिब बिकेम ईजी एंड हाउस होल्ड नेम ओनली बिकॉज ऑफ नसीरुद्दीन शाह एंड गुलजार। तो मेरी बहुत ऐन खुशकिस्मती है कि नसीर साहब यहाँ तशरीफ़ लाए। मैं बिल्कुल इससे पहले पर्सनल तौर पे उनसे वाकिफ़ नहीं था, किताब पढ़ के उन्होंने मुझे फ़ोन किया एंड ही सेड सैफ आई हैव कॉल्ड यू ओनली टू थैंक यू फॉर राइटिंग दिस बुक। तो बहुत मेरी खुशकिस्मती, ऐन खुशकिस्मती है कि तशरीफ़ लाए हुए हैं। बहुत शुक्रिया।